Alright, so today, let's talk about time-based effects. First, let's start with reverb. Reverb is short for reverberation. It refers to the lingering decay of a sound as it bounces off surfaces in an acoustic space. In music production, reverb is an audio effect that generates artificial ambience to simulate the kind that might occur in a natural environment. Audio engineers and producers use reverb devices in place of acoustic reverb to have greater control over the sonic properties of the ambience. This allows them to ensure that the length, quality, and blend of room reflections is sonically pleasing and appropriate for the mix. So let's talk about why reverb is used in mixing. Reverb is used in mixing to situate a sound within the artificial space of a mix. Ambience helps sound captured by a microphone feel more natural to the listener. It also enhances the blending of different instruments by creating the illusion of a shared acoustic environment. With all those benefits, you might be wondering why engineers don't just record the sound with natural reverberation to begin with. In some cases they do, but it often doesn't give the best results for a number of reasons. Before the introduction of artificial reverberation, the only way to create reverb was by recording it acoustically. This meant capturing a sound source in a large environment with naturally reflective surfaces. There are a few downsides to this method. First off, qualities like the time and timbre of the reverberation can't be easily changed in a single room. But more importantly, large reflective spaces make it difficult to capture the sound without sonic coloration from the room. When sound waves emanate from the sound source and reflect off the walls, floor, and ceiling, the reflections blend the direct sound when they reach the microphone. In some cases, the direct sound and its reflections can reinforce each other, but they can also create what's known as destructive interference by canceling each other out. This colors the sound and gives engineers less control, making it difficult to balance in a mix. The solution? Controllable ambience with predictable qualities that engineers can adjust to meet their needs in the mix. That's where reverb comes in. Let's talk about how to use reverb in your music production. Using reverb is definitely an art form, but that doesn't mean it's difficult to get started. After all, your DAW probably comes with a built-in reverb plugin you can start using right away. In music production, the best way to learn is to experiment. But if you need some beginner tips to help you get started, let's talk about it deeper. So, there's two ways you can set up reverb in your DAW. One, create an aux send and aux return channel to run your reverb in parallel. This lets you blend in the effect signal without changing the level of the unaffected sound. Number two, insert the reverb on the aux return channel and set its mix control to 100% wet. Number three, send sources to the reverb channel by increasing their send level. Number four, tweak the reverb parameters to dial in your desired sound. Let me demonstrate right now.
Here's a spoonful of sugar, I bet you it help put the medicine down.
Alright, so my vocals are routed to an auxiliary track. I'm going to use a send to do this parallel effect, which is just going to take a duplicate signal and send it somewhere else. So I'm going to go down here to new track on my sends and do new track. I'm going to create a stereo auxiliary track and I'm going to call it reverb. Alright, now on that track, I'm going to add a reverb plugin. Notice that I'm going to keep the wet-dry mix 100% wet. And then all I have to do next is turn up the send level and you will hear reverb on the vocals.
Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Tyler with the fits, super catchy.
So the reason we keep it 100% wet is we dictate the amount of level by the send here. Alright, now let's look at a different reverb plugin to talk about some of the parameters. Now each plugin is different, but most share at least some common parameters for adjusting the reverb's behavior. Here are the most common controls you'll find on reverb plugins and how to set them to get the sound you're looking for. First, let's talk about the decay time. Decay time sets the overall duration of the reverb tail. Longer settings produce a spacier trailing decay that gradually fades into the background. Long decay times are generally associated with larger acoustic spaces like cathedrals or concert halls. Try these if you're looking for an expansive ambient reverb. Shorter settings produce closer, more abrupt reflections that can simulate a small or enclosed acoustic space like a tiled bathroom. Now let's try playing around with the decay time.
You know how the car work, yeah, that's how it go.
Now let's hear a shorter decay time.
You know how the car work, yeah, that's how it go.
And as you can hear, quite a difference. So it's definitely important to make sure that you set the proper decay time so it doesn't get in the way of your music, but also creates a sense of depth, dimension, and 3D space. All right, now let's talk about pre-delay. Pre-delay introduces a short delay before the reverb signal begins its decay cycle. It's used to give the dry signal some space before the reverb kicks in. This is especially useful for dense reverbs that build up quickly. If the reverb signal feels too present on the onset of notes or hits, try increasing the pre-delay time before reaching for the decay time or wet-dry balance. So this can be a really good technique to kind of separate your vocals from the onset of the reverb to give them space and allow them to have clarity.
They just been holding me down. Look at the flag they'll throw. They won't be passing me up, they just gassing me up, man, they foot to the flow. You know how the car work, yeah, that's how it go.
So you can almost hear a delay in the start of the reverb, and and it kind of separates it from the vocal. So pre-delay is a very important parameter that often gets overlooked. And to sum it up, if it's still confusing, just think of it as the start time for when the reverb happens. Some will allow you to do negative pre-delay, but most is positive values. And that's just going to be the start time for your reverb. All right, now let's talk about damping. Acoustic spaces react in different ways to the frequency content present in a sound. For example, the brightness, darkness, and weight of acoustic reflections is affected by the materials of the surfaces and the geometry of the room. This absorption of high and low frequencies in acoustic reflections is called damping. By altering your reverb plugin's damping controls, you can affect the tonal balance of the reverb signal. Try a high damping value in the high frequencies of a long reverb to emulate a spacious cathedral. Now let's play around with the damping controls.
Gary, why you saying that? By the time they alert the authorities, they'll be on the plane back. I got a hold on the city. They wouldn't put me on hold. They just been holding me down. Look at the flag they'll throw. They won't be passing me up. They just gassing me up, man. They foot to the floor.
So as you can hear, that really does change the characteristics of the reverb. Now let's talk about diffusion. Diffusion controls the distance between early reflections. As you increase diffusion, the early reflections are closer together, producing a thicker sound. Lowering the diffusion creates more discrete separations between reflections for a more open effect. Let's hear the difference.
Pictures like animals wanting my face on the wall. I'm in the room with a two-sided mirror. I'm staring at them like you find as a mom. Try to fit in, wish you didn't.
So you can hear it's a slight effect, but it can also change the vibe of your reverb. Now let's talk about early reflections. Early reflections are those that reach the listener a few milliseconds after the direct signal arrives. Your brain uses them to identify the size of the room you're in. If you are trying to simulate a specific type of room, this control will be extremely important. This control allows you to set the level and decibels of the early reflections. The louder the early reflections, the smaller the room will seem. All right, I'm going to turn the reverb off so you can just hear the early reflections.
Foot to the floor.
All right, so now you're hearing none. Now let's turn it on.
Foot to the floor.
Do you hear that little slap back right there? That is the early reflections. So if you want to balance these controls, you can kind of change your perception on the room size.
Foot to the floor. You know how to call work. Foot to the floor.
All right, now let's talk about the wet-dry control. The wet signal is the processed or affected part of the sound, while the dry signal is the original or unaffected part. So we can have a certain type of blend using this. Now, really the only time I use this is when I put reverb directly on my track. So another way we can apply reverb without doing a send is to put it directly on our vocal track. Let's try that. Now, as you can hear, that's way too much.
Foot to the floor.
You can hear it's just a little bit of reverb and it works almost the same. But the reason it's good to use auxiliary tracks is that we can send multiple tracks to that one auxiliary track to save CPU processing. Not to mention, we can also add effects and mix that reverb channel where sometimes we don't have access to that on a plugin. This is what I mean. You can see I don't have a way to cut out the low end of my reverb. Now, I definitely want to let you know that cutting out the low end of your reverb is not something you always have to do, but it's often a really good idea because low frequencies in your reverb can really muddy up your mix. So now that I have this on an aux track, I can add an EQ before my reverb. Not to mention, I can filter out the high end and change the tonal characteristics of my reverb. Cutting out the low end and high end of your reverb is known as the Abbey Road trick, where they used to do this in the 60s to clean up the reverb sound, and this technique can really help complement a sound and free up a lot of space.
I think he did double the time. It's so deep when you look at my work. He taught me that, oh, what a guy. The way he was gripping the handle, I bet you he know that I'm...
See with the EQ on how much cleaner that reverb is? Now, do know that I'm exaggerating a lot of this so you can hear these sounds, but you get the idea. Not to mention, I could even add compression to my reverb to thicken it up.
I think he did double the time. It's so deep when you look at my work. He taught me that, oh, what a guy. The way he was gripping the handle, I bet you...
And I could even add distortion or modulation to make it whatever type of special effect I'm looking for.
I think he did double the time. See when you look.
Now let's just hear our reverb. So as you're probably starting to figure out, Using reverbs on an auxiliary track is a really awesome way to do so, and it gives you a lot more flexibility and saves on CPU resources. And do remember, lots of reverbs have built-in EQs and other effects like modulation, so you may not necessarily need to use an aux track, it might be built into your reverb. But I still recommend that most of the times you should use an auxiliary track. Sometimes though, it's absolutely okay if you just want to get a quick reverb sound, you can absolutely put it on your track, change the wet-dry, and blend it to taste. Alright, so first let's talk about a chamber reverb. The earliest reverberation devices used physical spaces to create ambience, called echo chambers. These were entire rooms dedicated to artificial reverberation. They worked by placing a speaker at one end and a microphone at the other. The engineer would play the recorded sound back through the speaker and capture the reverberation with the microphone. Real chamber reverb is impractical for the majority of studios because it requires so much space, but it had a unique sound that's associated with early hit recordings. But now we can have chamber reverbs in our plugins, and it sounds great. Let's try it out.
Dad would dose the dosage. I think he did double the time. It's so deep when you look at my work. He taught me that, oh, what a guy. The way he was gripping the handle, I bet you he know that I'm handling mine. It's never out of hand.
I really love chamber reverbs, especially for quick hip-hop songs where you don't really want the reverb to take up too much space. It sort of sounds like a quirky room sound, but it just has a nice vibe to it and helps the vocals pop through a little bit more with a little bit more dimension in 3D. So I use chambers all the time. Now let's talk about plates. The next innovation in artificial ambience was the plate reverb. It works by using a transducer to send an audio signal through a large plate of metal. On the other end, another transducer picks up the vibrations in the metal and converts them back to a sound signal. The result is a dense yet smooth reverberation that builds up quickly but doesn't get in the way of the dry signal. You can use plate reverbs on vocals, drums, guitars, anything that needs a smooth ambience to sit in the mix. So for pop productions, these are absolutely amazing.
Dad would dose the dosage. I think he did double the time. Dad would dose the dosage. I think he did double the time.
You can hear it has a smooth, almost metallic-like sound, and it's really great for pop productions, especially songs where there's big space and you need luscious reverb. Now let's talk about spring reverb. Like plate reverb, spring reverb uses the physical behavior of a material to simulate ambience. Known as electromechanical reverb, plate and spring both use transducers and metal to achieve their sound. Compared to a massive plate of sheet metal, a spring tank is relatively compact, but the coiled spring produces a different quality of sound that's slightly less realistic than that of a plate. Even so, spring reverb is an essential sound in music production due to its association with classical amplifiers and effect units from the 60s and 70s. Spring reverb has a short and cloudy decay with a characteristic drip sound when pushed hard. Let's listen to what this sounds like.
Dad would dose the dosage. I think he did double the time. It's so deep when you look at my work. He taught me that, oh, what a guy. The way he was gripping.
So you can hear a very quirky sound, and I probably wouldn't necessarily use this on vocals, but you could definitely use it on guitars or anything you want to bring out in a quirky way. Now let's talk about a room reverb. Based on the sound of smaller acoustic spaces, room reverbs sound most like the normal ambience we're used to hearing in the real world. Room reverbs impart a natural color and liveliness to a track. They're also the easiest to fit inconspicuously into a mix. Room reverbs are appropriate for vocals, guitars, piano, drums, just about everything. When used in moderation, these reverbs can add space to a source while maintaining an intimate, in-person character. So for me, I love using room reverbs on my vocals just to give it a little bit more dimension, and this will be in conjunction with a longer reverb. So how I like to mix my vocals with reverb is use a short room reverb and a longer reverb to add more vibe. We'll cover that in just a second. But let's hear what a room reverb sounds like.
Out of hand, and we ain't getting out of line. In person, they gas me up.
Now let's blend it in.
Out of hand, and we ain't getting out of line. In person, they gas me unleaded. On the net, they been nagging on pump fake.
So it just almost adds this invisible glue and helps the vocals sit a little bit better with the music. Now let's talk about hall reverbs. Hall reverbs replicate the sound of a concert hall. Because of their gigantic size, they have super long decays, even as long as several seconds. These reverbs are perfect for thickening up and adding space to strings and pads. They're also tailor-made for orchestral arrangements. So this one I don't use that often, but depending on the mix, sometimes I will use a hall reverb.
Out of hand, and we ain't getting out of line.
Now let's talk about algorithmic reverbs. As digital technology made its way into music production, engineers developed new methods to create reverb. Digital algorithms could simulate the effects of room reflections and provide even more control than what was possible with electromechanical methods. Not only that, early algorithmic reverberation devices pioneered new sounds that went beyond emulating physical spaces. Enormous modulated halls, gated nonlinear textures, and other special effects became common as this technology developed. Let's listen to one.
Out of hand, and we ain't getting out of line. In person.
Yeah, you can hear that definitely has a different vibe and sounds pretty cool. Now let's talk about convolution reverbs. Convolution is a technique that uses an impulse response to recreate the exact ambience qualities of a physical space. An impulse response is an acoustical measurement of a space that's taken by playing a special signal called an impulse and recording the result. By subtracting the audio information of the impulse from the recording, you have a sonic blueprint of the space's reverb. If that sounds complicated, don't worry about it, because convolution plugins will take care of all the behind-the-scenes work. Just know that convolution can create the most realistic ambience textures of all. In fact, many convolution reverb plugins come with a library of impulse responses captured at iconic real locations like churches, famous studios, and other special environments. So there are many types of reverb out there, and it's pretty hard to get a bad one these days, but I'll give you a few recommendations that I really like. Waves has a lot of amazing reverbs like H Reverb, R Verb. Another one of my favorites right now is ROM by Native Instruments. If you have a lot of money to spend, the Lexicon series, very expensive but incredibly good sounding reverbs. A company I'd recommend you maybe look at first is Valhalla. They have reverbs for $50, and the Valhalla Room and Vintage Verb are some of the best reverbs you can possibly get. Not to mention Valhalla Supermassive is a free one to get you started. So now let me show you how I would apply reverb to this vocal. I'm gonna make this first reverb a room.
Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with the fits. Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with the fit. Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with the fits.
So you'll notice that you can almost barely hear that. But here's a very important tip. Reverb, a lot of the time, should be something you feel, not hear, unless you're going for an exaggerated effect. So what I'm saying is be careful to not overdo it.
Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with.
Okay, now let's create a longer reverb. I'm gonna go to the send, new track, and I'm gonna go for a chamber reverb. I really like this in hip hop. I'm gonna option drag this to the other track. Let's pick a chamber.
Gary Poppins with the tricks.
Let's add a little bit of pre-delay. By the way, a really great resource I'd like to share with you. If you go to Google and type in delay and reverb time calculator, you can type in your BPM and get exact values in time with your song for pre-delay and decay time. Very useful. All right, now let's hear a chamber reverb.
Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with the fit.
All right, so let me dial that back. And then I'm gonna add just a touch of pre-delay.
Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with the fit.
Now, let's see if we can hear the difference.
Gary Poppins with the tricks, Wary Toddler with the fit. Super califragilistic, SBL dosage. That would dose the dosage. I think he did double the time.
So it's only really audible when I stop playback, but it's very slight. But it is adding a little bit of dimension and a little bit of glue to the vocals and helping them sit better in the music. All right, wonderful. Now let's talk about delay. All right, so delay is a powerful mixing tool for adding width, depth, and dimension to your tracks. However, sometimes it can be difficult to dial in the sound in your head, especially if you're not used to working with delays. Now let's break this down. What is delay? Delay is an audio processing technique that records an input source to a storage medium like a reel of tape or a hard drive, then plays it back after a user-defined period of time. Depending on the parameters, the signal may repeat once or multiple times and can even be fed back into itself to create the decaying echo effect. Delay can be a great way to add space to a track without taking up much room in the mix. Much like reverb, delay can be used to push a track back in the mix and create the illusion of depth. It can also be used to make tracks sound wider by using a stereo delay on a mono signal or panning the delay to the opposite side of the mix. Finally, delay can be a great way to add rhythmic excitement to your track. Whether you're adding subtle ambience to simulate an acoustic space or creating a trippy Radiohead-style delay loop, delays can be a potent form of ear candy that catches the listener's attention. Now, you might be wondering about the differences between reverb and delay. Both are time-based effects, but they add depth and space to mixes in different ways. Technically, reverb is a form of delay. What you're hearing is the sound of a delayed signal being played back in a reverberant space, which colors and smears the sound. All reverbs are delays, but not all delays are reverbs. Traditional delays simply repeat the original signal without simulating what it would sound like in an acoustic space. Others color the sound with different materials like a magnetic tape or different types of metal, but they don't smear the time element like reverbs do. All right, now let's talk about some delay controls. Most delay units feature pretty straightforward controls. The first is delay time, which is typically measured in milliseconds. This controls how long of a delay there is between the source signal and the delayed signal. You can set the delay time manually by ear or use some simple math to figure out the perfect timing. There are 60,000 milliseconds in a minute. To determine how long a beat is based on the BPM of your song, use this formula. 60,000 divided by the BPM equals 1 beat in milliseconds. For example, if you're working on a track that's 120 BPM, one beat is 500 milliseconds, 60,000 divided by 120 equals 500. Thankfully, most delay units also include a time sync feature, which automatically syncs up with the BPM of your tracks, so all you have to do is select the note length. In addition to standard delay durations like eighth note, quarter note, half note, most delay units also allow advanced note durations like dotted notes and triplets. One of the key elements of delay is feedback, which controls how much of the signal is fed back into the delay unit, and ultimately how many times something is repeated. When feedback is set to 0%, the signal is repeated once. When the feedback is set to 100%, it creates an infinite feedback loop, so be careful. Additionally, many delay units include tools for sculpting your sound, such as high and low cut filters. These can be used to remove unwanted low end or roll off the high end of a delay to help push it back in the mix and create space. Some delay units include rate controls, which adjust the rate at which the modulated signal oscillates. Turn up the rate to create a phasey sound that can be used to create different types of effects. And then the wet-dry. This controls and adjusts the balance between the original signal and the delayed signal. As we talked about earlier, when using an effects send, it's best to use 100% wet and 0% dry to retain complete control over both signals on separate faders. For one-off effects like throw delays, you can add the plugin directly to the channel and adjust the wet-dry to your taste. So to get a quick idea of delay, now we'll go back to delay, but I want to talk about some other effects real quick as well. Delay units are actually capable of creating a variety of different effects based on which settings you use. In addition to the traditional delay or echo that occurs when we hear a signal delayed by more than 50 milliseconds, delay units can also be used to create phaser, flanger, and chorus effects. These effects delay the signal by such a small amount that our ears can't separate the original from the duplicate, which helps us to beef up the sound. Let's first talk about a phaser. A phaser effect will delay different frequencies by varying amounts, which creates a rolling kind of underwater sound that works well for beefing up thin guitar tones or creating intentional effects. To create a phaser effect, set the delay time at 0 milliseconds, or as fast as the plugin will allow, and crank the rate control to increase the amount of modulation. The rate controls adjust how much the signal oscillates or how quickly it sweeps through the different frequencies. But do remember, there's dedicated plugins for this, so I just want to show you the sound of a phaser real quick. Now let's talk about flangers. Flangers are similar to phasers, but sound a little more obvious and apparent in the mix. They work by mixing an LFO into the original signal to create a shifting or sweeping sound across the frequency spectrum. Flangers are typically used to make instruments sound thicker or simulate a doubling effect. Flangers can definitely make your sound like it's underwater. Another common type of effect created using delay is chorus. Similar to a flanger, choruses use slightly longer delays, typically between 5 and 30 milliseconds, to simulate the effects of double tracking. Chorus effects use LFOs to introduce subtle variations in pitch and timing to make it sound like you recorded multiple takes. Chorus effects are commonly used to thicken up keyboards and clean guitars, and were a staple on just about every instrument in the 80s. Chorus effects also work great on vocals, especially for making background vocals and stacks sound huge. Gary Poppins with the tricks, wearing Tyler with the fits, super fragile SBL doses. So these are all really fun modulation effects, but now I want to go back to delays. So as you heard earlier, putting a delay on your channel is just going to create an absolute mess. There's much better ways to do so. So one way is to use a send. Gary Poppins with the tricks, wearing Tyler with the fits. Now as you can hear, that's just going to keep echoing forever, and that's not very musical. So I'm going to show you a better way to do so. Now we're going to be getting into automation soon, but I'm going to show you just a taste of it now. So if we go to my vocal track, we can see here that I have my delay send level automation. So if I click in this lane, I can draw in exactly when I want to send my vocals to the delay for a musical effect. So I can go command click, drag this up.
They just gassing me up, man, they foot to the flow. You know how the car work, yeah, that's how it go.
Let's try just the last part.
You know how the car work, yeah, that's how it go.
And as you can hear, you can create a cool effect to echo out parts. Now I want to show you a really cool effect with sidechain ducking and delays. I'm going to create a send on my vocal channel called Vox Duck. Now on my delay channel, I'm going to put a compressor that's attached to that sidechain input. This is going to duck the delay while the vocals are active. But then when the vocals stop, it's going to open up the delay and allow it to echo out. You could also use this effect with reverb as well.
Look at the flag they'll throw.
And sometimes you can even use more than one compressor.
Look at the flag they'll throw. They won't be passing me up, they just gassing me up, man, they foot to the flow. You know how the car work, yeah, that's how it go.
right, now let's hear this effect.
Yeah, that's how it go.
So as you can see, as soon as the vocal stopped, the compressors opened up and allowed the delay to echo through. Now, this isn't always the best way, but sometimes if you set it just right, it can work. But be careful because you might hear this distracting delay echoing underneath, so you have to set this just right. So this can be a great automated way to have your vocals echo when they're not active. Now I'm going to show you the way I prefer the most. So what I'm going to do is go Option-Shift-D and duplicate my vocal track. I'm going to add a delay directly to this track. I'm going to keep it at 100% wet, maybe turn the feedback down. And now any part that I want to delay out, all I have to do is drag it onto this track.
Know how the car work? Yeah, that's how it goes. That's how it go.
So as you can hear, very effective, very simple. Now any part that I want to delay out, all I have to do is drag the audio onto this track. This is my favorite way to do a delay throw or a reverb throw, and it's very easy to set up. Now there's many delays out there, but as far as my favorites go, H-Delay by Waves is a really simple one, and I love using it. But then one more I definitely want to recommend is Echo Boy by Sound Toys. This is probably one of the highest end delays you can possibly use with very advanced controls. But either of these are fine, and you can even use simpler units that might come stock in your DAW. All of them are pretty great. So as you can hear, with time-based effects, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities to create depth, dimension, vibe, cool effects, ear candy, all of these awesome things. So definitely try it out and have fun. Take care, everybody.